How you guys doing today? I don't know how many of you guys know this, but I've got another teenager in my house. I should say I only have one teenager now. My other daughter's 22 now. I can't believe it, but Matt just turned 13 years old. Wow. Exciting times in the King household. Cats, teenager, lots of fun. Gotta love it. How you guys doing today? You know, it's great to be thinking about the things of God. I appreciate Pastor Steve's tenacity, his strength, his boldness. I love working under him. I appreciate his willingness to speak what he feels like God's put on his heart. It's great to be under somebody like that. I appreciate that. There isn't a lot of people that have, guts, tenacity. A lot of people are very afraid of what other people think, and I'm grateful that he is very strong. And we're starting a new series today called Flow, and I told my daughter that, and she laughed. Like, what does that even mean? Well, yeah, good question. What does flow mean? But we're trying to talk about learning to flow in the Holy Spirit, learning to align with God, learning to get ourselves right in the middle of what the Holy Spirit is saying and doing in the world. Anybody want to do that? So we're going to be doing this, and the desire is what? To see God move more powerfully, to see God touch us, empower us, stir us, quicken us, show us his ways. So I get to start this series off, and I was really praying about, okay, God, what do you want me to talk about, And there's just some things that began to kind of be birthed in my heart, a little bit, and I'm going to have you guys today turn with me to the book of Habakkuk. Now, I remember the old preacher used to say, I'm not talking about Habakkuk and all the other kooks. Habakkuk. I'm not Jewish. I don't know how to say it quite right, but the old minor prophet there, that's somewhere there in the middle, the part that probably you skip over an awful lot. We're going to be looking at chapter 3 here in a little bit, but you say, well, you're jumping right into this. Well, not yet. I want to talk to you a little bit about Habakkuk for just a minute. The world he was living in was a world with a lot of trouble. Now, I had somebody tell me the other day, well, isn't always in the Bible a lot of trouble? Well, yeah, because the world hasn't really changed that much over the centuries. There's political problems. In the biggest context of this book is, you got the people of God acting like nitwits and fools, and there's trouble on the horizon for them, and they're trying to figure some things out. Now, that doesn't sound familiar at all, does it? So there's questions. People say, well, God, what? How do we do this? How do we respond? Where do we go? Who do we be? How do we see your spirit, your life, your goodness? It's one of those situations. How many of you guys have ever heard, the Bible principle, you sow whatever you reap? How many of you guys sit back for a minute and go, I've sowed some pretty bad stuff. Like I'm now praying for crop failure. I've been running my mouth, or I have the wrong attitude, or maybe I haven't, done the things I ought to do. And you get a nation's been sowing things, and it feels like, okay, oh my goodness, there's going to be a day of reckoning. Something might come that we don't want. And these challenges, these issues, these questions. What do we do when we're facing things that seem bigger than us? What do we do when it doesn't look as hopeful as it should be? I think Habakkuk gives us some insights into this. And, anybody know what I'm talking about here today? Sometimes you look up and you say, I need a little more. I need God to come in a powerful way. I need God to come into our nation. I need him. I need his presence. I need his power. I need his grace. I need him to come into my family situation. I need him to come into my health situation, my finances. Needs something to happen, and maybe it doesn't look too promising. It doesn't look like good things could happen in the natural. Habakkuk speaks to that, and start here in chapter 3, verse 1. I just want to read a little portion of it, and we're going to unpack a little bit of this and talk here for a few minutes today. But it says, it's a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, and he says, it's like on a song. There's like almost a prophetic song going forth. How many of you guys like the idea of praying with music and worship and crying out to God? This is kind of what this particular prayer is. that he's looking at his nation. He's looking at the spiritual condition. He's looking at the potential judgment of Babylon come marching in on them. And they deserve it. They've defied God. They've rejected God, rejected his ways. They've turned away from everything that's good. But Habakkuk says, I don't want it to be the way it is. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on song, and he prays this, O Lord. O Lord. Anybody here pray, O Lord? Yeah, I think it's something we need to learn to pray, O Lord. I mean, sometimes you don't even know what to say, O Lord. O Lord, I cry out to you, O Lord. Hear the yearning. Does anybody here know how to make a sound? This sounds like a little more, O Lord. O Lord. I've heard about your fame. I've heard about what you've done before. I've heard of the legendary tales. Anybody here ever heard any legendary tales? Stories, adventures, testimonies. I've heard of the old tales of Moses. I've heard of what Elijah did when he called down fire from heaven. I've heard of your fame. I've heard of the things of old. He says, and I stand in awe of these things, these deeds, O Lord. What a prayer. Anybody here know how to pray prayers like that? And I want to kind of take this for just a minute, and I think I want to talk to you guys about some things, because a lot of what revival is, a lot of what God is inviting us to is to covenant renewal. You say, what in the world is that? It's about restoring relationship, restoring family, restoring connection, restoring something that's been lost. And part of covenant is understanding shared relationship, shared identity, shared responsibility. And part of what he's praying here is this. He's praying, Lord, I know who you are. I know your nature. I know your character. But not just that. I know what you've done. And he's starting to rehearse and practice the testimonies. I don't know if you guys know this or not, but all through the Old Testament, Israel was commanded to remember the testimonies, to remember the story. Some of you guys know the story when they crossed the Jordan River. They grabbed these big old huge boulders and stacked them out in a big pile. And they said, when your kids ask you later on what this pile is, tell them how God split the water and enabled you to walk through to the other side. See, over and over again in the Bible, the ancients were told, remember how God moved. Remember what he said. Rehearse it, remember it, celebrate it. Make it part of your festivals. Make it part of your conversations. Make it part of your moments. There's a man that went and visited Israel a few years ago. It would have been maybe the 80s or whatever. And he went out and he began to tell a story about how the enemy came in and started marching against them. And they did all these different things. And he told the story of what Israel's army did to counteract the enemy. And one of the guys that was there said, well, what, were you in the 1967 war? He goes, no, I'm talking about the Maccabean revolt. He said, well, you were talking like you were a part of the war. He goes, I was. Because he identified so much with his heritage, so much with the old story, so much of how God moved in the past, that as if he was there, as if he was walking with those soldiers decades before, centuries before. See, on a certain level, God's called us to remember the stories, to remember the moments, to remember the testimonies. You know, you can read about it in Psalm like 119 and Psalm 78 if you want to look them up later on. Israel's commanded, rehearse, celebrate, treasure the stories, treasure the moments, particularly when it gets hard. In my own phone, I have videos I've filmed of people who've given testimonies of great things God's done. And sometimes I'm feeling like garbage. I pull one of those videos out and start playing it. And I get to see again who God is and what he does, how he moves. Covenant is remembering what God has done, who he is, and where he's at. And sometimes when we're in the middle of covenant breakdown, we need to begin to rehearse and remember once again who the Lord is. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that today. You see, I think all of us in this room don't realize that we are privileged to be a part of a group who has experienced wonderful things of God. You say, well, I don't even know what you're talking about. I mean, you hear revival, you hear all these things. What does that even mean? Well, I want to try to put this in context if I can. This is what I think the Lord put on my heart. But see, like you talk about the old stories. I remember for myself sitting down with my grandpa when I was a child, and he was saved in the 1930s in the revival movement. And when he would talk about the Lord, his eyes would light up. And he would talk about the kinds of things that would happen in these tent meetings and how God would move in these just marvelous tales of revival. And it seemed like a whole other world to me, like, wow, this is so crazy. But it was a story, and I was hungry for what he was talking about, even though I didn't really understand it so well. And I found out later on in my family that I was actually one of my grandfathers was named John King. He was a physician in England and got converted by John Wesley in the latter part of the Great Awakening. Came to an outdoor revival meeting in London, and the fire of God fell down on him. And he actually gave up his inheritance. His family rejected him, and he moved to the United States in 1770 to be a revival preacher. What a story. He went and broke open a revival in Baltimore, and they still make woodcuts and things of how he brought the message of God to the United States. I started hearing these stories, like, wow, who is this? What is this? Like, I want to understand what someone would do to give up on their family inheritance. He was part of the gentry in England, and he gave up everything he had to come to the United States to preach Jesus and to spread the message of the kingdom. So, that's some of my story, but see, it's not just my story. We all have stories. We're all rooted in a history, a background, a nation that has been ignited in revival over and over again. You say, I don't even have any idea what you're talking about. Well, listen to me for a minute. Let me tell you of the Lord's fame. Let me tell you what he's done in days of old. You say, I don't understand that. Well, that's okay. Just listen to me. Just walk with me a little bit, because I want to tell you about family members you don't know about stories maybe you've never heard about before. I mentioned already that my grandfather was converted by John Wesley, but he was one of the major figures that broke open the Great Awakening, and it spread all over England and the United Kingdom on up to the United States. Thousands of people began to fall on their faces before the Lord. They would hear preaching. It said sometimes it sounded like thunder, and they would cry out to God with shrieks, and just multitudes converted and saved. Many of these people were people that the church had overlooked, people that were forgotten, people that were considered poor, insignificant. But people like John Wesley and George Whitefield and others, they spread and they ignited young preachers, and my grandfather was one of those men. And in the United States, they had a famous tradition of these preachers called circuit riders. And these men would go out on basically almost no pay, no nothing, and they would travel circuits all up and down the United States, preaching revival meetings and talking to a bunch of pagan, alcoholic, immoral people. America, we always imagine, America's this holy, pristine nation. No, we were a bunch of castaways from forgotten families of England who came over here. They were alcoholics, violent, and vile. They talked about America like it was getting ready to be worse than France when they had the French Revolution. Many of the people moved into the frontier wanting to get away from church or anything moral. People over and over again said that America is about to collapse. The political picture, war, conflict, and turmoil. But these young preachers like my grandfather said, no, we're gonna preach Jesus. We're gonna go to the people that won't even listen to us. And we might have to carry a Bible in one hand and a gun in another, but we're gonna do it anyway. And they went out to these wild, raucous places where some men would come to mock them, and the power of God would come on them so hard that they'd fall over. Many came to check out the ruckus, and suddenly they heard a message. It was so compelling, they couldn't do anything but fall on their faces and cry out to God. Outdoor meetings, they would build brush arbors, like these little posts, and cut off tree limbs and have outdoor meetings. People say there's no church. That's okay. We can do it anyway. Well, there's nothing of God around here. That's okay. We'll make it. We're going to bring something, of God into this place. We're going to sing. We're going to pray. We're going to release the goodness of God's kingdom. John Wesley told my grandfather to scream no more because he was a powerful screaming preacher. And he said that people don't really want to hear that, but he was wrong because the Second Great Awakening broke open and all the preachers were like my grandfather. The fire of God came down on them, and they would have these outdoor meetings, camp meetings, and thousands would gather to hear, to listen. People would be overwhelmed and overcome by Jesus, the goodness of him. I'm going to read you a little account from one of these meetings. This is from James Finley. He was an evangelist. He's talking about the Cane Ridge camp meeting. He says, the noise was like the roar of Niagara. The vast sea of human beings seemed to be agitated as if by a storm. I saw at least 500 swept down in a moment, as if a battery of 1,000 guns had been opened upon them. And then immediately followed shrieks and shouts that rent the very heavens. At the time this was going on, they said America was Egyptian darkness. Our nation was about to have a financial failure and a moral failure. Most of the preachers had given up on our nation, but the young revival preachers said, no way. They went and preached, organized these camp meetings, and a nation on the brink of disaster was turned around just in a matter of a decade. The fire of God began to touch the heathen, the wicked, the unrighteous. Thousands and thousands began to join the church. Another preacher during this time period described one of the revival meetings and said this: the power of God seemed to shake the whole assembly. The cries of the distressed rose almost as loud as his voice, the voice of the preacher. No person seemed to wish to go home. Hunger and sleep seemed to affect nobody. Eternal things were the vast concern. Here, awakening, converting work was being found in every part of the multitude, even something strangely and wonderfully new to me. People say, I don't understand this thing about revival. Did anybody ever tell you that revival was what shaped the American nation? Anybody tell you it's what saved us from ruin? Anybody tell you that it was revival that birthed the hunger for freedom and independence in the Revolutionary War era? The revival pulled together a bunch of independent, reckless alcoholics in the frontier and caused them to become civil, kind, and halfway decent people. Oh, you didn't hear this in class, did you? You say, well, Pastor, I don't know what you mean when you're talking about revival. I'm talking about the very thing that was defining our nation. Talking about the very thing that led many of your family members far enough back to fall on their face before God as the strength and glory of God broke in. You say, well, I didn't know this was such a part of American history. Sure it is. Read Huckleberry Finn. Huck goes down the river and comes into a revival meeting, describing the very things I'm talking to you about. It's right there in American literature. Well, I didn't know America was like that. I know you didn't know that. I'm telling you about the way God moved, telling you about what happened in days of old, telling you about how God touched many. Revivals continue. I told you about the first and second Great Awakening, but it continues. The third Great Awakening period, 1800s, God's moving. People are praying. They have a prayer meeting that breaks open all over the major cities in the United States. Thousands and thousands of people are praying and crying out. Because what? Because there was a bank crisis. People had lost their money. The threat of business was dangerous, and the people were concerned, and they began to cry out to God. And thousands upon thousands of people began to be converted and give their life to Jesus. Multitudes being brought in. Our nation became a nation of prayer in many ways, many revival meetings, holiness meetings, people crying out, lots of camp meetings, tens of thousands of people coming to Jesus, many in this era. And God began to move powerfully just like he'd done before. People say, well, what's happening? Well, people are crying out to God. The power of God would come on them. Some of them would shake because the glory hit them so much that like their body doesn't know what to do. You say, well, what does that even mean? Well, John Wesley said this: sometimes what we have is an outer response of an inward work of God. Something happens in you so big and powerful, you can't help but just sort of react in some way. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that something big is happening. If you try to jam the ocean into a thimble, it's probably going to cause something to happen. People say, I don't understand all this falling. I don't understand all this standing. When he appears, who can stand? You're going to tell me the God of the universe breaks into something and there's going to be no response? No physical response, nothing happening to the body. I'm sorry, that's just not how this works. People say, well, that stuff's weird. People falling or shaking. Well, if it's weird, it's been weird for hundreds of years then. Well, you're just working that up. You're just making that happen. No, I'm sorry, I can't do that. Over and over again. You may have already seen it, but they have a cartoonist drew a picture of a Mariah Woodworth Eder meeting in St. Louis in 1890. The glory of God would come down in the room and people would collapse. They didn't hardly know what to do with it. One of the famous painters in Kansas City, Bennett, painted a holiness meeting where woman preachers praying for a sick child. It's part of our American culture, part of our identity. People crying out, people expecting the stupendous works of God. Revival comes and it raises up those that are overlooked, those that are forgotten. It begins to disrupt our culture. It is very much rooted in the American experience. It's very much rooted in what has delivered us in generation after generation. These are the ways of God. These are the ways that God has moved. God speaks, God moves. My grandfather was saved in what some might call the Fourth Great Awakening or in the Pentecostal revival shortly after the turn of the century. Lots of people being impacted all over. That revival really started about an hour up the road, Topeka, Kansas. People gathered and prayed, and many, many people began to experience God's glory and power. They cried out. God touched them. My grandfather was one of them. People that were far from God, that didn't know the ways. God moved. They had tents. They went and preached in little tent meetings. I grew up going to some of those little tent meetings. As hot as can be, and sit there, and just these preachers, they would just give it their all, crying out to God. In the middle of those hot, sweaty places, people's lives would be touched. People would be delivered of darkness. They would get hope. People would recommit themselves to their marriage. They would commit their way to God, and they would give up. I remember going to some of those meetings, and people would be throwing down their cigarettes, and sometimes you'd see drug paraphernalia landed on the altar as they cried out to God, and there was like a moment of holiness, a moment of consecration. That real lives are being impacted. God was moving and giving people hope again in the face of great turmoil. You say, well, I didn't know if all these things. Well, I hope you do now. You say, I don't know if I identify with them. You should. You say, I don't know if that's part of my family. What is now? That you are part of this heritage, part of this story. When Habakkuk says, I've heard of your fame, I'm talking about the Lord's fame here. Revival keeps going. I could spend a long time doing this. But again, I budgeted that I wasn't going to spend as long with this. Revival continues. Every generation sees God moving and touching in the face of political turmoil, in the faces of crisis, in the faces of terrible threats, in the face of terrible sin and selfishness and pride. God begins to move. In the mid-century, 20th century, there's moves of God, tents all over the United States. Thousands of people being healed and brought to life. You had the charismatic renewal in the 60s and 70s. They had I don't know how many it was, maybe 40,000 people at Arrowhead Stadium in 1977 crying out to Jesus right here in Kansas City. Over here at at Colonial Presbyterian Church, they had the Jesus People revival break open there in that time. And hundreds and hundreds, well, actually thousands of young people from Kansas City got saved and got off drugs and actually gave their life to Jesus. That revival just spread all over the United States. In the 1960s, when there was threat of Russian war, every day you would hear about the threat of an atomic bomb. You had terrible social and cultural unrest. Everything looked like it was going to fall apart. All my family said that Jesus got to be coming back right now because I don't know how our nation could ever get worse than it is right now. You know, Black Panther movement, you know, the National Organization of Women, you had David Bowie and the androgynous clothing, men wearing women's clothing and all that. People are like, what is this? How could our nation ever be like this? And then we say today, everything we're in is unprecedented. Maybe it is unprecedented on the scale, but we've had lesser versions of this same thing in previous generations. And even then, many said, I don't know if revival could come. Nobody ever believed that God could move among the hippies, among those who with leftist politics. I could go on and tell you about the stories of God moving, God rescuing our nation in the face of terrible moments and times. Let me turn the corner a little bit closer to our own era. You know, we get into the 1990s and all, God began to move powerful ways. I mean, he's been moving all the way through, but things began to break open in Canada and over in Florida, you know, move of God stirring. People crying out to God, just like in the days of old, just like in the Second Great Awakening, the fire of God. The youth pastor from the Brownsville Revival used to play this CD in his office, and I wanted to get a copy from him, but he wouldn't give it to me, of just the sound of the crowd in the revival, just the roar of the crowd. And if you know that sound, you know what I'm talking about. There's kind of a sound of people praying and intercession and the rumble, and you can hear almost the sound of heaven in the midst of the people. You know, and those moments and God moving and people crying out and people being deeply touched. I could tell you, say, well, Pastor JD, I don't care about all this history. I get it. That's okay. But I'm going to move a little closer to home, our own church. You know, some of you here, you don't know the story of our own church. That's okay. I don't want to say that like that's a bad thing. I mean, why would you know? You just showed up. How would you know? It's okay, but whether you know it or not, that old story is your story too. Whether you know it or not, these are the kinds of things that color the environment. These are the kinds of things that would cause Pastor Steve to come up and exhort the way he does, because something happened and powerful moments have happened. And you can go back and you know, there's a revival. Our church had an explosive revival take place about 80 miles up the road in rural Smithton, Missouri. And I mean, just powerful moments. I've got some great pictures here that I want you to see, and people just praying and crying out. I mean, a room, you know, that was not very big, and every person's jammed into the room. Every time somebody worshiped, they'd elbow you in the face and pop you, you know, and you were gonna be jumping and worshiping whether you wanted to or not, because the floor was moving with you. And then people in there, and they're crying out to God, and just voices and sounds and encounters. I could spend a whole day talking to you about the marvelous things that God did. And here's this great picture of Pastor Steve and Kathy praying for a man that flew in from Asia, you know, to come in this little bitty rural place, wanting a fresh touch from God. And, you know, just people praying and crying out. And people would actually come and line up like on Friday afternoon, like right after lunch, so they could get into the building that night and not have to be in the overflow room. You say, I don't know if I believe that's true. Well, it's true. Revival begins to do these incredible things that cause people to hunger, that cause inexplicable things to happen, that awakens things in people's hearts. There's so many great stories, you know. All those stories of tent meetings, and we had our own version of that over here when we first moved to Kansas City. 1,000 people in an old musty tent. It was hot, smelly, and miserable, but Jesus was there. I don't really miss the tent. But, you know, that's not old. I mean, God has continued to move, and I included one of my favorite pictures of all. This is not a doctored picture, you can see. This is actually Pastor Steve praying for a good friend of mine, a pastor from Green Forest, Arkansas. And right there, what you see is the fire of God coming all over him in a meeting. This would have been, about 2010 or so. God moving, touching. You say, I don't know if I believe all this stuff. I don't know what to tell you. And what God has done, is not forgotten. It's not over with. The stories are not over with. God has done marvelous things in days of old. Habakkuk said, Lord, I've heard of your fame. I stand in awe of these incredible deeds. I stand in awe of what you've done. I remember the stories. Whether I lived them or not, I celebrate them. I know how you moved in my nation, Habakkuk said. I know how you delivered my people. I know how even in the face of the ultimate political threats, in the face of severe judgment and wrath, I know you've changed lives, Lord. I've heard that. So I want to read this to you here. Habakkuk 3:2. Oh Lord, I've heard of your fame. He's singing it, he's crying it out. Stand in awe of your deeds, oh Lord. This is what he said. This. You say, everything I did in the sermons is introduction for this. You say, well, okay, you gave me a bunch of old history today. You showed me a bunch of old woodcuts. You showed me some pictures of our church, but I wasn't here then, so what does this matter? Well, it matters a lot. The stories matter a lot. The adventures matter a lot. The things that have happened are vital. The way God has moved is important to remember. It's important to celebrate. It's important to talk about. It's important to make it a vital part of who we are. Why? Because Habakkuk prays this. He says, Lord, I've heard about all these great things, but it's not enough to just hear about what came before. It's not enough to just hear the old stories. It's not enough that my grandfather left his medical practice in England to come to the United States. It's not enough that some of you in this room had a touch 10 years ago or whatever. It's not enough. It's not enough where we've been. I mean, that's great, important. But part of the reason why we remember the testimonies, part of the reason why we rehearse the history, part of the reason why we go back over that is because it becomes a catalyst for something new. It becomes a stirring in our soul. When we heard what God did, when we heard what he said, when we hear about the way he works, when we catch something of his nature, of his personality, of his heart. See, Habakkuk, he knew this. He got this. He said, Lord, I'm going to talk to you about who you are. I'm going to talk to you about the way you've operated. I'm going to come before you with covenant talk. I'm going to come before you reminding you of the ways of old. But I'm coming before you not just to talk about that. I'm coming before you to make a covenant renewal. I'm coming before you to not talk about what was, but on the basis of what was, I want to talk to you about what is now. I want to talk to you about what can be in our midst now. Habakkuk says, my God, Babylon's standing at the gates. We've done everything wrong. There's perversion, wickedness, selfishness, and pride. We've lost our way. We've sown terrible seed. We are in a pickle, God. But I've heard about what you did before. I heard about the way you moved. I've heard something about your nature. I've heard something about what you're like, Lord. So I'm just going to talk about it. I'm going to let it stir in me. But not just that. Here's what he said. He said, Lord, in light of all of that, in light of where we've been, in light of what's already happened, Lord, I pray would you renew these things, renew these stirrings, renew the deeds of old in our day. You say, what do you do in the face of turmoil? What do you do when the enemy is breathing down your neck? What do you do when wicked forces want to take your children? You feel powerless because of all of the ugliness and despair and political turmoil and social upheavals. Such foolishness and disregard and sin and corruption. When people see a young generation, they ask, will they ever turn to the Lord? Habakkuk tells us what we should do. What have you done before, Jesus? What have you done? What do you like? And Lord, now we pray. We pray, Lord, would you renew this in our day? That in our time, in our season, in this day, let them be known. What a prayer. Somebody would say, well, what are you talking about, Habakkuk? I mean, have you seen how wicked everybody is? Have you seen how foolish they are? Have you seen how much they've turned against the Lord? I mean, I don't know if you realize this, but judgment's pretty much guaranteed, is what they would say. And they wouldn't be wrong. But Habakkuk says, oh Lord, I know we may be in a corner here. I know it might not be easy. I know that we may be in a mess. But Lord, I know what you've done. I know how you've moved. I know how you've touched lives. Would you do that again in our day? In our time. You say, well, what does it mean to pray for revival? What does it mean to believe in it? It is to pray this, that renew them, revive them in our day. What? The things of old. You say, well, what does a revival look like? It's probably going to look something like some of those things I talked about. Like some of the moments and those awakenings, something of that. People being shaken, people being convicted, people being invigorated with beauty and wonder and power. People who are watching the darkness and corruption fall off them. Masses of people that one minute had no reason to love Jesus and the next minute they love him with all their heart. Because God quickens them, stirs them. You say, well, what do you want, Pastor JD? What do you want? I want God to renew them. In our day, in our time. And he says this line right here. He says, in wrath. You say, well, what do you mean? That didn't sound so good. Well, they were already stirred up wrath. There was already judgment possible. He says this, in wrath. In the threat. In the crisis, remember mercy. So what are we praying for? We're praying that the things of old, the deeds of old, would be renewed again. The kinds of things that led my ancestor, Dr. John King, to give up everything. The kind of thing that my grandfather, an orphan, heard that made him fall on his face and cry out to God for the rest of his life. The kinds of things that had caused this church to move from a rural Missouri to Kansas City to believe that God could do something great. So what are we doing? We're believing that what has been said, what has been done will happen again. That we would have the stirrings, that we would have the things beginning to stir in us again. Let it be, Lord. Let it be in the midst of us. You say, I don't know what this is. I don't know what this is. I don't know what revival is. I think I've been shut out from this. Well, hear the stories. Catch something of the heart of this. Get something of the spirit of this, because God will begin to renew them again in our day, our time. Sing whatever you want to, John. You say, I don't know about all this. Well, I don't guess you know about what Christianity's been all about for centuries. You say, I don't know if I know about what all this activity is. I don't know if I know what this is with people on their faces. I don't know if I know what all the shouting is. I don't know what all this is. Well, I understand. This is not a new thing. This is not a brand new thing. This is actually just the renewal of God's work as in days of old. The kinds of things that rescued people on the brink of disaster, the kind of thing that caused people that were facing evil and corruption and darkness to get rescued. The revival over and over again has rescued us, and it will rescue you. Will you pray with me that God would renew it again in our day and our time? Let's let that prayer kind of rise up right now. Oh Lord, renew them again. Renew these ways of old in our day, in our time. Let it be known, Lord. Jesus, we need you so much, Lord.